we have now looked at the basic texts and some of their characteristics from the Old Testament. We're going to do the same thing for the New. The New Testament, there's actually a whole lot more stuff and some more things to talk about, which it's interesting. I will try to move through this relatively quickly since a lot of this information is in your notes. And of course, in the books, please read them. There's some just tremendous information there. So now let's look at the New Testament. And the first thing we want to talk about is the manuscript types. Okay, types of manuscripts. It kind of sounds strange, but the way things were written, the way the lettering was done is important in understanding some of these texts because these are written, a lot of them in Greek. And we're going to talk about two different types of manuscript types. The first one is called an uncial. And these are the most important, and there's about 650 copies. And the reason I'm going to be mentioning these number of copies here is a lot of things we take for granted as historical or literary masterpieces. We just go, sure, no problem. We usually have one or two copies of those texts, and they're usually separated between 1,000 and 1,500 years between the original writing and the copy you have. We have 650 copies of these, and some other places we have thousands of copies, 2 and 3 and 4 and 5,000 copies. And if you got that much, a lot of people say, do you have 100% of the Bible? And scholars will say, well, you actually have 105% of the Bible. In other words, we have everything in the scriptures and then some. So the key is sorting out the and then some. So it's not like we don't have good representation. We have a lot. And so these uncials, these for the New Testament, there's 650 copies of them. So there's a lot to test and check and go over. The thing that's important about these is they are written in a form that makes them easily identifiable because they are written in all capitalization, there is no spacing, and there is no punctuation. Now, this places unsealed text prior to the 9th century. So they cannot be any older than that because the writing form changes. So before that time, everything was done in capital letters. You see a lot of Roman stuff. Well, the Greek stuff was all written the same way. What's really interesting is I have in your notes, and if you haven't taken a look at it, try reading this. This is an English representation of what an unsealed text would look like. And the thing about it is I actually wrote it here. It says, here's an example of what it would have looked like if written in English. This would be simple for the students today since there would be no need to learn punctuation. I would not want to have to grade these assignments, however. And see, I wrote that, and I have a hard time reading that. And you can imagine, all the letters are just running together. There's no space, no punctuation. So you have to know the language really well even to pick out the words. Somebody from another language would have a tough time picking them out. But these unsealed texts are written like that. So sometimes they do give scholars a little bit of a challenge, because in here I have no need, but I could also read none ed. Well, if I didn't know the language, well, is it none ed or is it no need? Because those two words are put in there. So it's quite fascinating when you do that. So these are the ones that the scholars typically go to because they're the oldest, they have lots of copies of them, and they're very, everything's just written out exactly without any extra anything to them. Now, later on, we get a text type called a minuscule text. And a minuscule text is from the 9th century on. And it's kind of funny, minuscule texts are actually harder to date because there's so much variation in them. The unsealed texts are much more consistent and they're easier to do dating on. Now, minuscule basically means small. Something is a minuscule. Your parents give you a minuscule hamburger or a minuscule steak. Well, it means small. I don't have much. And these are, again, later ones. They append in more of a cursive style as opposed to a block style. They're used small letters, or what we refer to as lowercase letters, which actually comes from the printing industry. But these particular texts, you can tell they have to be 9th century or later because of the writing style has changed. Then we get a thing referred to as papyri, or papyrus. Papyrus is the reed. Papyri are the texts that are made from the paper, if you will, that are made from the papyrus reeds. This also changes the format of a lot of stuff when you have the papyrus, because they change it from scrolls that you roll up to what is referred to as a codex. In other words, pages. So what we consider a normal book today is really what would be referred to in this case as a codex. And instead of on our wood pulp paper, it was done on papyrus type of paper. So it had pages just like we do, except it's a lot thicker, a lot heavier, and all that kind of stuff. What's interesting about this is these fragments of scriptures were not really discovered until the mid-1700s. And these papyrus were actually unearthed when people were doing the excavation of Herculaneum, and where Pompeii is, Herculaneum and Pompeii, where Mount Vesuvius blew up in the 1st century. And you have Pliny the Younger and Pliny the Elder and all those kind of guys. The guy dies in it. So cool history. But what they did is they dig up, they're doing archaeological excavation, and they find these papyrus. And these are nearly 2,000 years old. And then people go, well, if the papyrus here can be in this dry climate, can survive for almost 2,000 years, because we know when Herculaneum went under, I wonder if in the desert regions of Egypt and Syria and Jordan and places like that, we might find some of these. And so they started going and looking for them, and they actually discovered them in the late 1900s and upwards into the 1930s. So there's some of these things that they find that are some of the key ones are the Chester Beatty papyri, discovered in 1931, the Bodmer papyri, which are unearthed in the 1930s, the Oxyrhynchus papyri, unearthed right at the 1896-97 and following. And what's really fascinating about this, and this is something that you kind of go, wow. The oldest fragment, at least that I know of, or that I've read about anyway, the oldest fragment of the New Testament dates from prior to the middle of the 1st century. It's from the book of the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verses 31, 33, and 37 and 38, because it's a fragment, just the pieces of it. And it dates prior to the first half of the 2nd century, so before 150 AD. The Gospel of John was written somewhere 80s, 90s AD, and this is somewhere before this. And because it was found in Egypt, and Christianity was in Egypt very early, you're looking at something that could be within less than a lifespan from its original writing to the copy. It could be even within a few years. So we have fragments that are that close to the original Gospel of John. And again, they match up with later versions and things like that. So that's kind of cool that you got that close versus, hey, I got 1,500 years before my last translation of the Iliad or the Odyssey or things like that. Isn't that neat? That's really cool. So these papyri, we have roughly 5,300 manuscripts available for scholarly use, and there's fragments and other pieces like that. And this is why it says that we have 105%, because we actually have, sometimes you go like, there's an extra word in here, or there's an extra something in here. So we actually have all the text and then some. So they got to sort this stuff out. So think about this. You got 5,300 New Testament manuscripts. You've got these uncials. You've got these minuscule texts. And then you have full codexes and full books and other kinds of stuff. And we're going to talk about that because one of the things about the New Testament text in particular, and it works the same in the Old Testament, but there's what they call text families. Now think about this. If I'm sitting here and making a copy here where we are here in Denver, and somebody else is making a copy in Sao Paulo, and somebody else is making a copy in Melbourne, the odds are that the copies of those copies of those copies of each of those locations, errors that get introduced, slight spelling variations, other kinds of things are going to be geographically consistent. Somebody making the same mistake in Melbourne and Sao Paulo, possible, because, optical tricks, the way we write and see things, sometimes you'll get those type of errors that are common. But most likely, they're going to be copied regionally, and they're going to have similar characteristics. which is a bad thing, and it's also a good thing. You get more errors, if you will, or variants. They're not errors, but variants, because there's a big difference between an error and a variant. This is their textual variants, not errors, because the scriptures don't have errors. We make variants of them. And so you're going to see these kinds of text families, and you're going to see that. But the cool thing is now you can compare them. As the variations between you, you say, well, that one and that one have a variation, but these other ones don't. So what's the most likely answer? These guys and this one all match. That's the one that's out of sync. So what's the most likely? Somebody put an error in there, a variant, if you will. So we have 4 basic classes of text type families, if you will. We have the Alexandrian, and it's probably the most accurate from a scholarly perspective. And it originates, again, from the region around Alexandria, Egypt. We have the Caesarean, which is second most from a scholarly perspective. Variations are more accurate. And that comes from modern-day Israel, Jordan, and Syria. Then you have the Western family, which comes from Europe. It's the third most accurate. And then you have the Byzantine. And that's considered the least accurate. And again, these are relative terms. It's not like there's this horrible differentiation. The Byzantine one comes from modern-day Istanbul, Turkey, which used to be Constantinople, which used to be Byzantium. So Byzantium became Constantinople, and Constantinople has become Istanbul. So they're called the Byzantium texts. And these are the text families. Now, question.
Yes. Would it correspond kind of to the age of them? Would the older manuscripts be more Alexandrian, the later manuscripts be more in the Byzantine? I mean, does it kind of do?
Oh, so the types. It's not necessarily age per se. It's typically more associated with the isolation. And the more isolated things get, or the more people have the ability to muck with it, the higher probability you're going to get wider variations in it. Especially if a literacy problem. Well, one of the reasons the Alexandrians are probably the most accurate is because you had tremendous academic and literary skills and all those kind of things in those regions. Versus when you get to the Western text, you ended up with the Dark Ages in there. So they're going to have more chance of polluting them. Again, those are just generalities. The exact reasons, I'm not sure. Okay. But when we get to the unsealed texts, and again, we said these are the most important ones. These are the oldest ones. We have 3 really key ones. And they're referred to as the Vatican manuscript, which is referred to as the B text, and that's how they're labeled. They have different labeling schemes that go along with them. And this is from the 4th century. We have the Sinaitic manuscript, or the Aleph text, which is, again, 4th century. And then we have the Alexandrian, or the A text, which is from the 5th century. Now, that's basically the order of how accurate or how solid these things are, and of course, completeness too. Now, what's cool about the Vatican text is it is the oldest of the texts, and it's also the most complete for the New Testament. It has been housed in the Vatican Library since at least the mid-1400s, so it's been there for a very, very long time. It contains both the Old Testament and the New Testament in Greek. So again, you have Greek Old Testament and Greek New Testament, which again, nice comparison with words and usages and things like that. Again, it's a codex, so it's pages, not scrolls. And it's one of the interesting things is a lot of people question about the Gospel of Mark. You've got the section in Mark 16, 9 through 20, and you see it in the scriptures, and it's commented out in other places. It's interesting to note that particular text is not in the codex itself, but there's space for it. So right in there's this like blank gap. So it's like whoever was copying it says, well, I know there's this Mark 16, 9 through 20, but I'm not so sure whether I should put it in there or not put it in there. But I'm going to leave space just in case. Well, evidently it was never put in there. So it's interesting that even at that point, people are going, yeah, is it real? Is it not? How does it fit? So they left space just in case. Kind of a funny thing. Now, the thing that's interesting about this codex, though, is it was not available for study until 1867. and there were photographic copies made in 1889 and 90. So that's the first time scholars could actually look at it and study it. So again, you can imagine this is probably the finest quality, most complete of these unseals, and yet it wasn't until basically the turn of the century, the 19th into the 20th century, that this really becomes available for scholars to even look at, to say, well, how accurate do what do we have? And so it's kind of cool. But it also tells you something about earlier translations. It's missing some of the best text we have. Then we get to the Sinaitic manuscript, and it's interesting also in Lightfoot's book in chapter 4, there's the story of how it's discovered. And this Konstantin Tischendorf finds it in St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai. And how he finds it, it's a really fascinating story. It's really worth reading that chapter just to see how it goes about, how he finds it. And he finds this in 1844, but it's not accessible to anybody until 1869. So again, you find it in the mid-1900s, mid-19th century, and it's not available until later in that century. And that's just availability to study, much less distribution and people going to see it. It's not like people could take lots of pictures and scan it and send it over the internet and say, hey, there's the picture. You actually had to go and see it. You actually had to go look at it. You had to have access as a scholar to even look at these things. And it's currently on display in the British Library, and about 4/7 of the original pages, so a little better than 50% of the original pages are part of that text. It is most likely the oldest of those key texts. So it's lesser in quality and completeness, but it's probably the oldest also. Then we get to the Alexandrian one, which is a 5th century, or the 400s. So again, 4th centuries are 300s, 5th century are 400s. So again, this is where we're talking way back. These are very old texts. And they're third in quality. And the thing that's interesting about this one is it has varying quality within the books within the text. And some of them resemble Western text types. Some of them resemble Sinaitic. Some of them are different kinds of the different families, if you will. And so it's varying quality, book within it. It was actually the first one that scholars got a chance to look at. And the thing that's fascinating about this, the Patriarch of Constantinople provides this as a gift to Charles I of England. Okay, Charles I of England is the successor to King James, who was the guy who the King James Bible he commissioned it and it's named for him. So the guy after the King James Bible gets the first access to one of the oldest text types. That's the oldest codexes. And it comes from the Orthodox Church, who had this as a copy, who gives it to a British monarch. Quite fascinating. The interesting note is the King James Bible was printed in 1611. This codex is given to the King of England in 1627. So nobody even had a chance to even consult this one before it was done. So all of these are post-King James revelation, and yet these are the best texts we have. Kind of an interesting idea. And we're going to again cover some of those post-King James ones next lesson. Now, the minuscule texts that we talked about, they come from the 9th century, and there's about 2,800 of them, and most of them are the Byzantine type. The Byzantine type family are probably the least reliable from a perspective of accuracy in their copying. Blech. Can't speak this morning. But one of the things that's really interesting is, again, a little anecdotal story. Minuscule 61 comes from the 15th or 16th century, found in Dublin, Ireland. And it is the first manuscript found to support, quote unquote, the three heavenly witnesses in 1 John 5, 7, and 8. And a lot of you'll see that text in modern translations of the Bible today, and very unlikely that it was in any of the originals, because the first time you ever see it is in the 15th, 16th century. Now, how in the world did it get into your Bible then? If it's so late, well, if we've already seen some of these other texts were not available until later, it would show that these didn't exist. And some people were really pressing because it got stuck into a Latin text. And so Erasmus, who was one of the first compilers of a Greek text for translation, this is during the Reformation time period, if I remember the story correctly, he said, look, I can't put this in my Greek manuscript unless you find me something in Greek that I can go with. And so when Minuscule 61, oh, look, we found one, Erasmus, in his third edition, he said, all right, you found a Greek manuscript. It looks old. I'll stick it in there. Well, Erasmus's text was in the 1500s. Well, guess what? That then became a basic Greek text, which people started using for translations. Therefore, that Three Heavenly Witnesses from Minuscule 61, from his third revision of his Greek text, gets put into the Bibles. Because they, of course, are saying, hey, there's Erasmus' scholarly text. We'll just translate it. Later on, you find out, it wasn't there. Because these older copies say, nah, that wasn't there. It's a very fascinating little story. And you know what? It's still in the Bibles you read today. Most of a study Bible, they'll put a little bracket around it and say, this is probably wasn't there. You see the same thing with other places in the text. So again, what you read and what a textual critic would tell you comes down to what they find out from these texts. So, have a couple more things we want to look at. Latin Vulgate. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because the Latin Vulgate I've already talked, referenced from the Old Testament. The New Testament uses the same source material. Now, the Latin Vulgate by this time has also had some challenges with it because there's been attempts to take the variations in its text and consolidate it. Matter of fact, after or during the Reformation time period, the Catholic Church actually brought back to stuff and said, okay, here's our new copy of the Latin Vulgate. And because from the other texts, they had to do the same kind of textual criticism, destroy all the old copies, here's the new copy. So we really probably don't have what Jerome actually did. The thing that's interesting is sometimes a word translation or a shift in the meaning of a word over time, the idea of repentance and penance shift, and how he translates it into Latin and then how it gets morphed actually takes a word that a Protestant would recognize, hey, this is repentance, metanoia, change of mind, the way you think about stuff, and gets morphed into, oh, by the way, you need to do penance. And so just by the way it got translated will change an entire doctrinal position. It's quite amazing. Now again, this could be just a shift in the understanding of a word over time, but that is a very subtle thing. So again, translations are really critical, how it shows up. Next, we have some more Syriac versions. And again, this is the same, Syriac is essentially the same as Aramaic. And they had some very early translations in the New Testament. One that's really important, and it's for against higher criticism stuff, which we're not going to talk about in this class, but it's referred to as the Diatessaron, and it's in Syriac. And what we would call it today is a harmony of the Gospels. Basically, a gentleman named Tatian, who was a pupil of Justin Martyr, took the four Gospels and sort of integrated it all together, put it all in one book, and they called it the Diatessaron, and it means through four. Well, that's kind of cool because, when you're studying, going through the four Gospels, you're trying to say, okay, when did that happen? When did this happen? What was this? Which was the right sequence? How did that all go? Well, that's what Tatian does. He says, here, let me give you a harmony of the Gospels. It's so popular that it actually requires in the 5th century to actually stomp it out because people were abandoning the four Gospels for using the Diatessaron in Syria. And we know that he was in Syria around 170, so mid-2nd century. And we find the fragments or references to it. Again, there's no copies of it that exist today, but references to it way out in the Syrian Roman fort out in the middle of nowhere. And a lot of scholars want to say, oh, the Gospels were written so much later. And this pretty much gives you the evidence that the Gospels were written way early. So if it's found itself way out into the desert, and it's that popular to get out there, then the four Gospels themselves had to have been written. It had to have been written earlier, and the fact that somebody wants to go and take the four Gospels and put into a diatessaron says they have to be way earlier also. So this drives the source of the four Gospels that we have way earlier because of the knowledge of this diatessaron, even though we don't have a copy of it. So it's fascinating that a non-existent book is critical in saying that the Gospels weren't written sometime later. They were actually written way earlier. So it's kind of another one of those little fascinating things. We also have the old Syriac versions, and these were discovered in the 19th century, and they date from the 5th century. They're very similar look and feel to the Sinaitic Bible, the Greek Bible that was found at St. Catherine's Monastery. And again, here's that Mark 16:19 through 20. One of them has some of them have a copy of it in it, and other ones don't. So in some of them they say, nope, it's not part of it. And other ones say, it's there. Just like we see in our modern Bibles today. We see it in there, even if it's got the little annotation on it. Some other things that are important are Coptic versions of the New Testament. And Coptic basically is the later development of the Egyptian language. And the language was then written in Greek. So it was Greek lettering for Egyptian, which is referred to as Coptic. And these are very high quality texts. They are very similar to the Vatican and Sinaitic manuscripts. And they have two different forms. There's from southern Egypt or upper Egypt, which is, no, lower Egypt is in the south. Yeah, upper Egypt's in the south, lower Egypt's in the north because of the way things roll. And these are very important texts. And they go from the 3rd and 4th century and the 4th and 5th century. And because they're written in Greek, you can now again make some comparisons, very high quality. Christianity was in Egypt in a very early time. So these texts really help you out, again, matching up with these other texts of that age. And they match up really well. So that kind of gives you a quick, really fast flyby of all of the different texts and the families and some of the ramifications of them for the New Testament. Next, we're going to look at English translations.